The beer glass slipped. Just a tremor in weathered hands, nothing more. But the bartender saw an excuse to act on what had been building all evening. The old man's quiet presence at the end of the bar had been bothering the younger crowd, his simple clothes and careful movements marking him as different, unwelcome in their modern sanctuary of craft cocktails and artisanal everything. When amber liquid splashed across polished wood, the bartender's voice cut through the Friday night noise like a blade. "That's it, old man. You're done." The 73-year-old looked up, confusion clouding tired blue eyes that had seen more than anyone in that room could imagine. His hands, marked by decades of honest work and something else entirely, trembled slightly as he reached for his wallet. Not from fear, but from the medication that kept his war-damaged nerves functional enough to face each new day. "I can pay for another," he said quietly, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to diffusing situations rather than escalating them. But the bartender was already moving, his youth and position giving him confidence that bordered on cruelty. The Friday night crowd turned to watch, smartphones emerging like vultures sensing carrion. This was entertainment now, the public humiliation of someone who couldn't fight back, couldn't defend himself in ways that mattered to this generation. "You've had enough. You're making other customers uncomfortable." The lie hung in the air like smoke. The old man had nursed a single beer for over an hour, his consumption so minimal it wouldn't register on any reasonable scale. But comfort wasn't really the issue. His presence was, his age was. His quiet dignity in a world that celebrated loudness was offense enough. The crowd watched as security approached, two men in their 30s who probably bench-pressed more than the old man weighed. They flanked him with the casual confidence of those who had never faced real opposition, never encountered strength that didn't announce itself with muscles and attitude. "Sir, we need you to leave." The old man nodded, understanding the futility of resistance. He placed a $20 bill on the bar, more than enough for his single drink and tip, and stood slowly. His movements were careful, deliberate, each step calculated to avoid the joint pain that had been his companion for decades. The crowd parted with theatrical disgust, as if age itself might be contagious, but what they saw as weakness masked something else entirely. The careful movements weren't frailty, they were precision. The quiet acceptance wasn't defeat, it was discipline learned in places where real strength meant knowing when not to fight. The tremor in his hands wasn't fear, it was the permanent reminder of explosions that had saved other men's lives. As he reached the door, someone in the crowd called out, "Maybe try the senior center next time, Grandpa." Laughter followed him, into the night, cruel and casual, the kind that comes easily to those who have never been tested by anything more challenging than a difficult parking spot or slow Wi-Fi. The old man walked away without turning back, his shoulders straight despite the weight of public shame, his dignity intact even as it was publicly mocked. The bar returned to its Friday night rhythm, the incident already becoming a story to share, a moment of cruel entertainment that would be forgotten by morning. The bartender wiped down the spot where the old man had sat, erasing the evidence of his presence as if he had never existed at all. But in the morning, everything would change. The first sign was the sound, a low rumble that started before dawn and grew steadily stronger. By 7 a.m., the noise was impossible to ignore, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The bartender, nursing his own hangover from after-hours drinking, stumbled to the window of his apartment above the bar. What he saw made his blood run cold. Military vehicles stretched down the street as far as he could see. Not just one or two, but dozens of them, forming a convoy that spoke of serious purpose and absolute authority. Humvees, transport trucks, and vehicles he couldn't identify filled the roadway, their olive-drab paint and military precision creating a scene that belonged on a battlefield, not on Main Street of a small American town. But this wasn't random. This wasn't a training exercise or a logistics movement. Every single vehicle was positioned with its front facing the bar, as if the entire convoy had come to attention before this one small building. Soldiers stood beside their vehicles, not in casual formation, but in the kind of attention that spoke of respect, of ceremony, of something approaching reverence. That wasn't just any old man they had thrown out the night before. If you believe that dignity doesn't retire with age, that respect should be earned by character rather than youth. Hit that like button and comment honor below, because some uniforms never truly come off, and some service never truly ends. The bartender's hands shook as he reached for his phone, the same tremor that had marked the old man's movements the night before, but for entirely different reasons. This wasn't medication or age or war wounds. This was fear, pure and simple, the kind that comes when you realize you've made a mistake so profound that its consequences stretch beyond anything you could have imagined. He scrolled through his contacts, looking for his manager, his owner, anyone who might help him understand what was happening outside his door. But even as he dialed, he knew that help might not be coming. This convoy wasn't here by accident. This display of military precision and power wasn't random. It was personal. The phone rang 3 times before his manager answered, voice thick with sleep and irritation. "This better be important, Jake. It's Saturday morning." "There's a military convoy outside the bar," the bartender said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like dozens of vehicles, soldiers. They're all facing our building." Silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Jake wondered if the call had dropped. When his manager finally spoke, his voice had changed completely, fear replacing irritation with mechanical precision. "Tell me exactly what happened last night. Every detail. Don't leave anything out." Jake's mind raced back through the events of the previous evening, details that had seemed insignificant 12 hours ago, now taking on weight that threatened to crush him. The old man's quiet presence, the spilled beer, the crowd's cruel laughter, the way he had walked away without fighting back, without even raising his voice in protest. "There was this old guy," he began, his voice gaining strength as he convinced himself that his actions had been justified. "Really old, maybe 70s. He was making people uncomfortable, you know? Taking up space, nursing one beer all night. His hands were shaking, he spilled his drink, and the crowd was getting restless." What did he look like? The question was sharp, urgent, cutting through Jake's narrative like a blade. He paused, trying to remember details that he hadn't bothered to notice at the time. The old man had been just that. Old, unremarkable. The kind of person who blended into the background of everyday life. Gray hair, kind of thin. Blue eyes, I think. Wore a plain shirt, nothing fancy. He was quiet, polite even when we asked him to leave. Paid his tab without arguing. Jake paused, a memory surfacing. He had this way of standing, you know? Really straight, even though he moved kind of slow. Another long silence. "Jesus Christ, Jake, please tell me you're joking." But Jake wasn't joking, and the convoy outside wasn't going anywhere. If anything, more vehicles were arriving, their diesel engines adding to the mechanical symphony that had transformed his quiet street into something approaching a military operation. This wasn't a show of force. It was a statement, a declaration that someone very important had been disrespected, and the disrespect would not stand unanswered. The old man they had thrown out wasn't just anyone. He was someone whose service, whose sacrifice, whose very presence commanded the kind of respect that could summon dozens of military vehicles on a Saturday morning. He was someone whose dignity, when publicly stripped away, became a matter of military honor rather than civilian indifference. And Jake was beginning to understand that the tremor in those weathered hands, the careful movements, the quiet acceptance of humiliation, none of it had been weakness. It had been strength of a kind that he had never encountered, forged in places and circumstances that his generation could barely imagine. The convoy wasn't just here for show, it was here for him. What they didn't know about the quiet man in the corner would change everything. Not just for the bartender who had thrown him out, but for everyone who had watched and laughed and done nothing to stop the casual cruelty that had unfolded in their presence. The morning sun reflected off military windshields, creating a light show that seemed to announce that justice, long delayed, was finally about to be served. And somewhere in that maze of military precision and power sat the answer to who the old man really was, and why his humiliation had summoned a response that would be remembered long after the last vehicle had departed. The old man's name was Frank Morrison, and his story began not in that bar on Friday night, but in the jungles of Vietnam 55 years earlier, when he had been 19 years old and convinced that he was invincible. 3 tours of duty had taught him otherwise. But they had also taught him things about courage and sacrifice and brotherhood that would define every day of his life that followed. He had been a medic in the 1st Cavalry Division, one of those soldiers whose job it was to run toward the sound of gunfire rather than away from it, to patch up wounded men under fire and carry them to safety when their own legs couldn't manage the task. His hands, the same hands that had trembled over a beer glass on Friday night, had once worked with surgical precision while mortars exploded around him, while bullets whined overhead, while men called out for their mothers in languages that spoke to the universal fear of dying alone and far from home. Frank had saved 37 lives during his time in Vietnam. Not kills, saves. 37 American soldiers who had walked away from situations that should have killed them because a 19-year-old kid from Ohio had refused to let them die. He had earned 2 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, and a Bronze Star with V for Valor, decorations that sat in a shoebox in his closet because there was no one left in his life who would understand their significance. But the war had taken its toll. The tremor in his hands wasn't just age. It was the permanent reminder of a mortar blast that had thrown him 15 feet and left him unconscious for 3 days. The careful way he moved wasn't just caution. It was the accommodation he had made for shrapnel that doctors had decided was too dangerous to remove. Metal fragments that would remain part of his body until the day he died. When he came home. In 1971, Frank had tried to build a normal life. He had married Sarah, a nurse who understood something about healing and didn't ask too many questions about the nightmares that woke him up screaming. They had raised 2 children, lived in the same house for 40 years, and created the kind of quiet, steady existence that looked unremarkable from the outside, but required enormous strength to maintain. Sarah had died 3 years ago. Cancer, taking her with the same relentless efficiency that had characterized her approach to everything else in life. The children lived far away now, their own lives too busy and complicated to include regular visits with a father whose stories they had heard too many times, and whose relevance to their modern world seemed increasingly questionable. So Frank had found himself alone at 73, rattling around in a house full of memories and medals that no one else cared about, trying to figure out how to fill the days between now and whatever came next. The bar had been an experiment in companionship, a place where he might find some echo of the camaraderie that had sustained him through the worst moments of his life. Instead, he had found cruelty, the casual kind that comes easily to people who have never been tested by anything more serious than a traffic jam or a delayed flight, the kind that mistakes age for weakness, vulnerability for worthlessness, and quiet dignity for something that can be safely mocked without consequence. What the crowd at the bar didn't know, what the bartender couldn't have imagined, was that Frank Morrison's name was still spoken with reverence in certain military circles, not because he was famous or powerful, but because he represented something that the military valued above almost everything else: the willingness to put others before yourself, regardless of the cost. The men he had saved in Vietnam had gone on to have careers, families, lives that might not have existed without his intervention. Some of them had become officers, rising through the ranks to positions of real authority. Others had remained enlisted, but they had never forgotten the medic who had risked everything to drag them out of harm's way. And when word spread through the military community that Frank Morrison had been publicly humiliated, thrown out of a bar like common trash, disrespected by people who owed their freedom to men exactly like him, the response had been swift and overwhelming. The convoy outside the bar wasn't just vehicles and soldiers. It was a statement that some debts can never be repaid, only honored, and that the men and women who serve their country in combat earn a respect that should last for the rest of their lives, regardless of age or circumstance or the changing fashions of public opinion. Colonel James Patterson had been a 20-year-old private when Frank Morrison had saved his life in 1970, dragging him out of a rice paddy while under heavy fire, working on his wounds for 20 minutes while bullets sang overhead. Now he was the commanding officer of the local National Guard unit, and when he heard what had happened to his old medic, his response had been immediate and unequivocal. The convoy was his idea, but every single soldier in it had volunteered. They came from active duty units, National Guard companies, reserve battalions, and veteran organizations throughout the state. They came because Frank Morrison represented something that military people understood, but civilians often missed. The idea that service creates bonds that last forever, that the man who saves your life becomes your responsibility in return. But the story was just beginning, and what happened next would transform not just one small town's understanding of respect and dignity, but would send ripples through social media and news outlets across the country, becoming a reminder that heroes don't always announce themselves with fanfare and crowds, and that the most dangerous mistake you can make is assuming that quiet strength is the same thing as weakness. The convoy had been forming since before dawn, vehicles arriving from bases and armories across 3 states, their crews driven by a sense of purpose that transcended normal military operations. This wasn't about following orders or completing a mission in the traditional sense. This was about honor, about brotherhood, about the kind of loyalty that forms when people share experiences that most of the world can never understand. Frank Morrison sat in the passenger seat of the lead Humvee, his weathered face impassive as he watched the bar through the windshield. He hadn't asked for this response, had actually tried to talk Colonel Patterson out of it when the phone call came at 6 in the morning. The public humiliation had stung, certainly, but he had endured worse things than the mockery of people, whose opinions ultimately meant nothing to him. But Patterson had been insistent, and as more calls came in from other men Frank had served with, other lives he had touched during 3 tours in Vietnam, it became clear that this was about more than just one old man's hurt feelings. This was about sending a message, about drawing a line in the sand that said some things would not be tolerated, some disrespect would not stand unanswered. The bartender who had thrown him out was watching from an upstairs window, his face pale, with a fear that Frank recognized from combat zones, the particular terror that comes when you realize you've made an enemy of someone far more dangerous than you had imagined. But Frank felt no satisfaction in that fear, no sense of vindication or revenge. He felt only sadness that it had come to this, that respect had become something that needed to be demanded rather than freely given. Master Sergeant Maria Santos sat behind the wheel of the Humvee, her own service record including 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. She had never served with Frank directly, but she had heard the stories, knew his reputation in the medical corps, understood what his presence meant to the older generation of veterans who had trained her when she was just starting her own military career. "You sure about this, sir?" she asked quietly, using the informal honorific that military people reserved for veterans whose service commanded special respect. "It's not too late to call this off." Frank considered the question seriously. The convoy represented hundreds of hours of volunteer time, coordination that had required favors and connections throughout the military community, fuel and maintenance costs that would come out of personal budgets rather than official military funding. All of this for one old man's wounded pride, for a slight that most people would simply forget and move on from. But as he looked down the street at the dozens of vehicles, at the soldiers standing at attention beside their trucks, at the flags and insignia that represented decades of combined service, he understood that this wasn't really about him at all. This was about something larger, something that the younger generation seemed to have forgotten in their rush toward a future that had no room for the past. This was about the idea that service matters, that sacrifice should be remembered, that the men and women who put their lives on the line for their country earn a dignity that should be respected regardless of age or circumstance. The bartender who had thrown him out represented a broader cultural shift, a casual disrespect for veterans that had become so normalized that it barely registered as offensive. The convoy was a reminder that some things are too important to be left to chance, too valuable to be taken for granted. It was a statement that the military community takes care of its own, that the bonds forged in combat don't dissolve with age or changing social attitudes, and that respect is not a suggestion, but a requirement. Frank nodded slowly, his decision, made not just for himself, but for every veteran who had ever been made to feel unwelcome in their own country, every older American who had been dismissed as irrelevant by people too young and inexperienced to understand what they owed to previous generations. "Let's proceed, Sergeant." It's time they learned who they were dealing with. The convoy wasn't there by accident, and what happened next would make it clear that throwing out the wrong old man can have consequences that stretch far beyond one Friday night's casual cruelty. Master Sergeant Santos keyed her radio, her voice, carrying the crisp authority that comes from years of military training and combat experience. All units, this is Alpha 1. Execute Phase 2. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Doors opened in perfect synchronization, and soldiers began emerging from vehicles with the kind of precision that only comes from extensive training and shared purpose. They weren't moving with the urgency of combat, but with something else entirely. The measured dignity of a ceremony, the careful respect of an honor guard, the unmistakable authority of people who understand exactly what they're doing and why it matters. Frank Morrison watched through the windshield as his brothers and sisters in arms formed up in the street, their movements creating a display of military precision that transformed the casual Saturday morning atmosphere into something approaching a state occasion. These weren't weekend warriors or parade ground soldiers. These were combat veterans, active duty personnel, and National Guard members who had interrupted their personal time to make a statement about respect and dignity and the way veterans should be treated in their own country. Colonel Patterson emerged from the command vehicle, his dress uniform immaculate despite the early hour, his bearing carrying the authority of someone who had spent 30 years learning how to command respect, rather than demand it. He had been up most of the night coordinating this operation, calling in favors, arranging logistics, ensuring that every detail would reinforce the message they were sending. The crowd was beginning to gather. Word had spread through social media and neighborhood networks that something significant was happening on Main Street, and people were emerging from shops and apartments to witness whatever was unfolding outside the bar. Some carried phones, ready to capture whatever was about to happen for posterity or viral distribution, but most simply stood in silence, sensing that they were witnessing something that demanded respectful attention. Jake the bartender was no longer watching from his upstairs window. He was on the street now, still in the clothes he had worn the night before, his face pale with the kind of fear that comes when you realize that your actions have consequences far beyond anything you had imagined. The manager stood beside him, equally pale but trying to maintain some semblance of professional composure, as if this were a customer service issue that could be resolved with the right combination of apologies and explanations. But this wasn't about customer service, and it wasn't going to be resolved with apologies. This was about something much larger, much more fundamental. The idea that every person deserves basic human dignity, that age and vulnerability should be protected rather than exploited, and that the men and women who serve their country in uniform earn a respect that should last for the rest of their lives. Frank Morrison stepped out of the Humvee slowly, his movements careful but dignified, his bearing straight despite the physical challenges that came with age and old wounds. He wore the same simple clothes he had worn the night before, no uniform or insignia to announce his service, no external indication of the significance that had summoned this massive display of military respect. But as he moved toward the bar, something extraordinary happened. Without any spoken command or obvious signal, every soldier in the convoy came to attention. Dozens of men and women, representing multiple branches of service and decades of combined experience, rendered honors to a man who most civilians would see as just another elderly customer, unremarkable and easily dismissed. The salute rippled through the formation like a wave, each soldier's movement precise and deliberate, their faces reflecting not just military discipline, but genuine respect for someone whose service had earned their admiration. Frank returned the salute with the same precision he had learned more than 50 years earlier, his weathered hand moving to his forehead with movements that muscle memory had preserved despite the passage of time. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the ceremony unfolded, beginning to understand that they were witnessing something significant, something that challenged their assumptions about the quiet old man who had been thrown out of the bar the night before. Phones appeared as people began documenting what was clearly becoming a moment of historical significance, a reminder that heroes don't always announce themselves with fanfare and recognition. Colonel Patterson stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of command, but also the warmth of genuine affection. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison, United States Army, retired, medic, 1st Cavalry Division, Vietnam War, recipient of the Silver Star, Bronze, Star with V device, and 2 Purple Hearts. More importantly, he's the man who saved my life in 1970 and the lives of 36 other American soldiers who went home to their families because he was willing to risk everything to drag them out of harm's way. The words hung in the morning, air like smoke, transforming the perception of the quiet old man who had been mocked and dismissed less than 12 hours earlier. The crowd began to understand that they hadn't just witnessed the humiliation of an elderly customer. They had witnessed the disrespect of an American hero, someone whose courage and sacrifice had earned him a place of honor that transcended age or circumstance. Frank Morrison looked around at the faces in the crowd, seeing recognition beginning to dawn, watching as shame replaced curiosity in the expressions of people who were starting to understand what had really happened the night before. But he felt no satisfaction in their discomfort, no sense of vindication or revenge. He felt only sadness that it had taken a convoy of military vehicles to remind people of something that should have been obvious from the beginning, that every person deserves basic human dignity, and that age and vulnerability should be protected rather than exploited. The bartender who had thrown him out was crying now, not from fear, but from shame, understanding finally that his casual cruelty had targeted someone whose service to his country had earned him respect that should have lasted a lifetime. The manager stood beside him, equally stunned, both men beginning to grasp the magnitude of their mistake and the implications it would have for their business and their community. But the real lesson was yet to come, and what Frank Morrison said next would transform this moment from a simple display of military respect into something much larger, a reminder about dignity and service and the way Americans should treat the men and women who have sacrificed to protect their freedom. If respect for our veterans matters to you, if you believe that service to our country should be honored rather than mocked, make sure to subscribe to this channel because there are thousands of stories like Frank's that need to be told, and millions of veterans whose sacrifices deserve to be remembered. Frank Morrison stood in the center of the street, surrounded by the military respect that had been absent from his life for too long, looking at the crowd of civilians who were beginning to understand what they had witnessed the night before. The morning sun caught the metal of military insignia and vehicle chrome, creating a light show that seemed to announce that something important was happening, something that would be remembered long after the last vehicle had departed. But Frank wasn't interested in spectacle or revenge. He was interested in education, in using this moment to teach a lesson that went far beyond one old man's wounded pride or one bartender's thoughtless cruelty. He was interested in reminding people of something that American culture seemed to have forgotten in its rush toward youth and novelty, and the assumption that age automatically meant irrelevance. He stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to speak calmly under fire, who had given orders that saved lives and made decisions that determined whether men lived or died. When he spoke, his words weren't angry or accusatory, but they carried the weight of experience and sacrifice that demanded respectful attention. Last night, I came to this bar looking for what every veteran is looking for when he finishes his service, a place where he belongs, where his presence is welcome, where he can find some echo of the camaraderie that sustained him through the worst moments of his life. Instead, I found cruelty, the casual kind that comes easily to people who have never been tested by anything more serious than a difficult day at work or a delayed flight. The crowd listened in silence, many of them beginning to understand that they were hearing something important, something that challenged their assumptions about age and respect and the way veterans should be treated in their own country. The bartender and manager stood frozen, their faces reflecting a shame that was beginning to transform into something deeper, an understanding of the magnitude of their mistake. "I don't tell you this story for sympathy or revenge," Frank continued, his voice steady despite the emotion that underlied his words. "I tell it because what happened here last night happens every day across this country, in ways both large and small. Veterans are dismissed as irrelevant, treated as burdens rather than honored as heroes, made to feel unwelcome in the very country they swore to defend." Colonel Patterson watched from beside the command vehicle, understanding that this moment was about more than just military respect or veterans' rights. This was about the fundamental question of how Americans treat each other, particularly how the young treat the old, how the strong treat the vulnerable, how people respond when they encounter someone whose appearance doesn't match their expectations of what strength or significance looks like. The men and women standing behind me didn't come here because I asked them to, Frank said, gesturing toward the convoy of soldiers who remained at attention, their respect unwavering despite the passage of time and the growing crowd of spectators. They came because they understand something that civilian culture seems to have forgotten, that service creates bonds that last forever, that the people who put their lives on the line for their country earn a respect that should endure regardless of age or circumstance. Social media was already beginning to spread word of what was happening on Main Street. Videos were being uploaded, photos shared, hashtags created by people who understood that they were witnessing something significant. The story of the old man thrown out of a bar and the military convoy that appeared the next morning was beginning to take on a life of its own, becoming a symbol of something larger than any individual incident. But Frank Morrison wasn't interested in viral fame or social media attention. He was interested in creating a moment of education, a teaching opportunity that might help people understand what they owed to the men and women who had served their country, and what basic human dignity looked like in practice rather than theory. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice carrying across the street with the authority of someone who had learned to command attention through character rather than volume. "This is about every veteran who has ever been made to feel unwelcome in their own country, every older American who has been dismissed as irrelevant by people too young to understand what they owe to previous generations, every person who has been judged by their appearance rather than their character." The lesson was beginning to sink in, not just for the people gathered on the street, but for the thousands who would eventually see the videos and photos that were being captured. This wasn't just about one incident in one bar. This was about a broader cultural pattern of disrespect that had become so normalized that most people didn't even recognize it as problematic. The bartender stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper, his shame evident in every word. "Sir, I had no idea. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Frank looked at him with the kind of compassion that comes from having seen real evil and understanding the difference between malice and ignorance, between deliberate cruelty and thoughtless mistake. The young man had acted badly, certainly, but he had acted from ignorance rather than hatred, from cultural conditioning rather than personal malice. "I know you didn't," Frank said quietly. "That's the problem. We've created a culture where disrespecting veterans, dismissing the elderly, mocking vulnerability has become so normal that good people do it without even thinking about it. But ignorance isn't an excuse anymore. Not when the consequences are this real, this painful, this damaging to the fabric of what makes us Americans." The community response was already beginning to form. Local business owners were emerging from their shops, many of them veterans themselves or family members of veterans, understanding that something significant was happening that would define their town's character going forward. The mayor was on his way, word having reached City Hall that a major incident was unfolding that would require official response and community healing. But the real impact was still to come, as Frank Morrison's words and the image of military vehicles lined up in defense of one old man's dignity began to spread across social media platforms and news outlets, becoming a reminder that heroes don't always announce themselves with fanfare, and that the most dangerous mistake you can make is assuming that quiet strength is the same thing as weakness. The transformation of Main Street continued as more people arrived, drawn by social media posts and word-of-mouth reports that something extraordinary was happening outside Murphy's bar. Local news crews were setting up equipment, understanding that this story had elements that would resonate far beyond their small broadcast area. The image of dozens of military vehicles lined up in defense of one elderly veteran's dignity was exactly the kind of story that captured public attention and sparked broader conversations about respect, service, and the way Americans treat their heroes. But even as the media circus began to form, Frank Morrison remained focused on the human element of what was happening. This wasn't about publicity or political statements. This was about education, about using one moment of cruelty to teach broader lessons about dignity and respect, and the way communities should function when they're operating at their best. The bar owner, Michael Murphy, had arrived and was standing beside his manager and bartender, his face reflecting a mixture of shame and concern that went beyond simple business considerations. Murphy's Bar had been a community institution for 20 years, a place where locals gathered to celebrate victories and mourn losses, where relationships were formed and memories created. The idea that his establishment had become the site of such a profound violation of community values was devastating in ways that went far beyond potential loss of revenue or negative publicity. "Mr. Morrison," Murphy said, stepping forward with the kind of nervous respect that comes when you realize you're addressing someone whose significance you had completely failed to recognize. "I want to apologize personally for what happened in my establishment last night. There's no excuse for it, and I take full responsibility for creating an environment where such disrespect was possible." Frank nodded, appreciating the sincerity but understanding that apologies, while necessary, weren't sufficient to address the broader issues that had created this situation. The problem wasn't just one bar or one bartender. It was a cultural pattern that had made such incidents not just possible but predictable. A social environment where age was automatically associated with irrelevance and quiet dignity was mistaken for weakness. "I appreciate your apology, Mr. Murphy," Frank said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had learned to address complex problems with patience rather than anger. "But this isn't really about your bar, and it's not really about your employee. This is about something much larger. The way we've forgotten how to recognize value in people who don't announce themselves with noise and flash. The way we've allowed youth to become the only measure of worth." The crowd had grown substantially, with people streaming in from across town as word spread about what was happening on Main Street. Many were veterans themselves, drawn by reports that one of their own was being honored by a military convoy. Others were simply curious, wanting to witness whatever extraordinary event had transformed their quiet Saturday morning into something that resembled a state ceremony. Among the gathering crowd were faces that Frank recognized from his decades in the community. The postal worker who had delivered his mail for 15 years, the grocery store clerk who always asked about his health, the librarian who had helped him find books about subjects that reminded him of better times. These were people who had known him as a neighbor and customer, but who had never fully understood the significance of his quiet presence in their community. Mrs. Eleanor Chen, who had been Frank's neighbor for 12 years, pushed through the crowd with the determination of someone who had something important to say. At 81, she moved slowly but purposefully, her own age giving her a perspective on dignity and respect that the younger members of the crowd might have missed. "Frank Morrison," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the street, "I have lived next door to you for 12 years, and never once did you mention that you were a war hero. Never once did you ask for special treatment or recognition. You've shoveled my driveway every winter, fixed my fence when the storm knocked it down, and brought me soup when I was sick with pneumonia. You are the finest man I know, and anyone who can't see that is blind." Her words carried the weight of personal experience and long-time observation, providing context that transformed Frank from a symbol into a real person whose character had been demonstrated through years of quiet service to his community. The crowd began to understand that this wasn't just about military service. This was about the kind of everyday heroism that often goes unrecognized, the small acts of kindness and service that define good neighbors and good citizens. The bartender, Jake, was openly weeping now, his shame having evolved into something deeper, a genuine understanding of the magnitude of what he had done and its implications for his own character and future. He was 26 years old, young enough that the Vietnam War existed only as historical abstraction, old enough that his ignorance couldn't be excused as childhood innocence. "Sir," he said, his voice breaking with emotion, "I don't know how to make this right. I don't know how to undo what I did." Frank looked at him with the kind of compassion that comes from having made mistakes of his own, from understanding that growth often comes through failure and shame, and the painful process of learning to be better. The young man's tears were real, his remorse genuine, his desire for redemption evident in every word and gesture. "You can't undo it," Frank said quietly, "but you can learn from it. You can make sure that you never again judge someone by their appearance, never again assume that age means irrelevance, never again mistake quiet dignity for weakness. and you can teach others so that what happened to me doesn't happen to someone else. The conversation was being recorded by dozens of phones, uploaded to social media platforms where it would be viewed millions of times over the following days. The image of a decorated war veteran showing compassion to the young man who had humiliated him, offering redemption rather than revenge, would become one of the most shared videos of the year, a reminder that true strength often manifests as grace rather than anger. Colonel Patterson stepped forward, understanding that the ceremony needed to move toward resolution, that the lesson had been taught and the point had been made. The convoy had accomplished its mission, not just honoring one veteran, but creating a moment of education that would ripple through social media and news coverage, reaching millions of people who needed to understand what they owed to the men and women who had served their country. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patterson announced, his voice carrying the authority of command, "we came here today to honor Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison, but we're leaving with something more important, a reminder that respect is not optional. That service should be honored, and that the quiet heroes among us deserve recognition and dignity regardless of their age or appearance." The convoy began to prepare for departure, soldiers returning to their vehicles with the same precision they had shown in arriving. But before they left, something extraordinary happened that would complete the transformation of this incident. From a moment of shame into a celebration of community values and veteran recognition, members of the crowd began to approach Frank Morrison, not as spectators or social media content creators, but as individuals who wanted to express personal gratitude for his service and apologize for the way their community had failed him. A line formed, stretching down the block as people waited their turn to shake his hand, to thank him for his service, to acknowledge the debt they owed to him and others like him. The line included children brought by parents who understood that this was a teaching moment, teenagers who had never considered what they owed to previous generations, middle-aged adults who were beginning to understand their own responsibility to honor and protect the veterans in their community. Each person who approached Frank carried their own story, their own connection to military service, their own understanding of what this moment meant. Sarah Martinez, whose son was currently deployed in Afghanistan, waited in line with tears streaming down her face. When she reached Frank, she took his weathered hands in hers and said simply, "Thank you for showing my son what it means to serve with honor. Thank you for coming home so that others could learn from your example." The moment was captured by news cameras and cell phone videos, creating an image that would define the story for news outlets across the country. An elderly veteran surrounded by community members expressing gratitude, his dignity restored not through military might, but through human connection and genuine respect. But even as the celebration continued, Frank Morrison remained focused on the broader implications of what had happened. This convoy, this outpouring of respect, this moment of community healing, all of it had been necessary because the simple human dignity that should have been automatic had instead been denied. The fact that it took dozens of military vehicles to remind people how to treat their veterans was both inspiring and deeply troubling. The real lesson was yet to come in the weeks and months that followed as Murphy's Bar transformed itself from a place that had hosted cruelty into a community gathering spot that actively honored veterans. The changes would be dramatic, visible, and lasting, proving that one moment of education could create ripple effects that lasted for years. Jake the bartender would become one of the most vocal advocates for veteran recognition in the community, his shame having been transformed into purpose, his mistake having become the foundation for a lifetime of service to others. The bar would institute policies that ensured veterans were not just welcome but actively honored, creating a model that other businesses would adopt throughout the region. But the most important change was less visible and more profound, a shift in community consciousness that made disrespecting veterans not just socially unacceptable, but personally unthinkable. The convoy had accomplished its mission not through force or intimidation, but through education and the power of example. Frank Morrison climbed back into the Humvee as the convoy prepared to depart, but he was no longer the same man who had been thrown out of a bar the night before. He was a recognized hero, an honored veteran, a respected member of a community that had remembered what it meant to value service and sacrifice. The tremor in his hands remained, the careful movements persisted, but the dignity that had been stripped away had been restored through the power of military brotherhood and community recognition. As the convoy pulled away from Main Street, leaving behind a transformed community and a story that would inspire millions, Frank Morrison understood that sometimes justice comes not through courts or legislation, but through the simple act of people remembering who they are supposed to be and what they owe to each other. The bar owner, Michael Murphy, stood watching the military vehicles disappear down the street, understanding that his establishment had been forever changed by what had happened within its walls. The casual cruelty that had seemed acceptable on Friday night had been revealed as something much more serious, a violation of community values and American principles that demanded immediate and comprehensive response. Within hours of the convoy's departure, Murphy had begun implementing changes that would transform his bar from a place that had hosted humiliation into a community institution that actively honored veteran service. The first step was obvious and immediate. Jake would be required to complete veteran sensitivity training before returning to work, and all employees would receive similar education to ensure that what had happened to Frank Morrison could never happen again. But Murphy understood that policy changes weren't sufficient to address the cultural problems that had created this situation. The real issue was deeper, a community-wide failure to recognize and honor the veterans who lived among them, a casual disrespect for age and service that had become so normalized that good people participated in it without conscious thought. The solution would be equally comprehensive. Murphy's Bar would become the first business in town to implement a formal veteran recognition program, offering free meals to veterans on Veterans Day, military discounts year-round, and most importantly, creating an environment where military service was celebrated rather than ignored. The walls would be decorated with photos and stories of local veterans, creating a visible reminder of the sacrifices that had been made to protect the freedoms that everyone enjoyed. The changes extended beyond the bar itself. Murphy began reaching out to other business owners, sharing the lesson he had learned about the importance of recognizing and honoring veterans in the community. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of businesses committed to implementing their own veteran recognition programs, creating a network of support that would ensure no veteran in their town would ever again be made to feel unwelcome or unvalued. Jake the bartender's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all. His shame had evolved into genuine understanding. His mistake had become the foundation for a life-changing commitment to veteran advocacy. He began volunteering at the local VA hospital, spending his free time with elderly veterans who had few visitors, learning their stories and understanding the depth of sacrifice that military service required. The education was profound and personal. Jake learned about Walter, an 80-year-old Marine who had fought at Iwo Jima and now sat alone in a hospital room, his service forgotten by everyone except the nurses who changed his bed sheets. He learned about Maria, a Vietnam War nurse whose PTSD had never been properly treated, who had spent 40 years dealing with nightmares and flashbacks while working as a teacher and raising 3 children as a single mother. Each story deepened Jake's understanding of what he had done to Frank Morrison and what Frank's gracious response had meant in the larger context of how veterans are treated in American society. The quiet dignity that he had mistaken for weakness was actually the product of experiences that had tested Frank in ways that Jake could barely imagine, had forged a strength that expressed itself through service rather than self-promotion. Within 6 months, Jake had become one of the most effective veteran advocates in the region, his personal story of redemption making him a powerful speaker at community events and veteran organizations. His message was simple but profound. Everyone has something to learn about respect in service, and the most important lessons often come from our worst mistakes. The community-wide transformation continued to ripple outward, reaching far beyond the original incident on Main Street. Local schools began implementing veteran education programs, ensuring that students learned not just about historical military conflicts, but about the living veterans in their own community. The library created a veteran oral history project, recording the stories of local veterans before those stories were lost forever. Perhaps most importantly, the incident had created a new awareness of the elderly veterans living throughout the community, many of whom had been invisible to their neighbors despite decades of residence. Frank Morrison's story had reminded people to look more carefully at the quiet older men and women around them, to consider what service and sacrifice might be hidden behind unremarkable appearances. The ripple effects extended far beyond one small town. The story of the convoy and Frank Morrison's gracious response had been picked up by national news outlets, becoming a symbol of both the problems facing veterans and the potential for community healing and recognition. The video of Frank showing compassion to the bartender who had humiliated him became one of the most watched clips of the year, shared millions of times as an example of the grace and dignity that characterized the greatest generation. But for Frank Morrison himself, the most meaningful change was simpler and more personal. He was no longer alone in his community, no longer invisible among neighbors who had failed to recognize his significance. The convoy had accomplished something that went beyond military honor. It had restored his place in a community that had forgotten what it owed to him and others like him. The tremor in his hands remained. The careful movements persisted. The physical reminders of his service continued to mark his daily life. But the dignity that had been stripped away in a moment of casual cruelty had been restored through an overwhelming display of military brotherhood and community recognition, creating a foundation of respect that would sustain him for whatever. Years remained. Frank Morrison had gone to Murphy's Bar looking for companionship and had found cruelty instead. But that cruelty had triggered a response that transformed not just his own life, but the entire community's understanding of what they owed to their veterans, what respect looked like in practice, and what could be accomplished when people remembered who they were supposed to be. The convoy was gone, but its message remained, etched in the memories of everyone who had witnessed it, embedded in the policies and practices of businesses throughout the community, reflected in the changed attitudes of people who had learned to look more carefully at the quiet heroes living among them. And in the end, that was the most important victory of all, not the public recognition or the media attention, but the simple restoration of dignity to one man whose service had earned him respect, whose age had earned him honor, and whose quiet strength had finally been recognized for what it truly was. 3 months after the convoy, Frank Morrison returned to Murphy's Bar for the first time since that Friday night that had changed everything. The transformation was immediately visible. Military memorabilia covered the walls, photos of local veterans created a gallery of service and sacrifice, and a prominent sign near the entrance proclaimed, "Veterans always welcome, your service is honored here." Jake approached him immediately. His demeanor completely changed from the arrogant young man who had thrown him out months earlier. The bartender's eyes reflected a combination of lingering shame and genuine respect. His voice, carrying the careful tone of someone who had learned hard lessons about dignity and recognition. "Mr. Morrison," Jake said, extending his hand with obvious nervousness. "I want you to know that not a day has passed since that night that I haven't thought about what I did and what you taught me about forgiveness and grace. You changed my life, sir, and I hope I can spend the rest of it proving worthy of the lesson you gave me." Frank accepted the handshake, seeing in the young man's eyes the kind of transformation that military service was supposed to create. The evolution from selfishness to service, from ignorance to understanding, from cruelty to compassion. Jake's redemption had been genuine and complete, his mistake having become the foundation for a life of veteran advocacy and community service. The other customers in the bar recognized Frank immediately, many approaching to thank him for his service, to share their own military stories, to express gratitude for the lesson his experience had taught their community. The atmosphere was everything he had hoped to find on that Friday night months earlier. Genuine camaraderie, mutual respect, the kind of belonging that veterans sought when they finished their service and tried to find their place in civilian society. But the most meaningful moment came when Frank noticed a young soldier in dress uniform sitting alone at the end of the bar, the same spot where Frank had been sitting when his ordeal began. The soldier was perhaps 22 years old, recently returned from deployment, still adjusting to civilian life and trying to find his place in a community that didn't fully understand what he had experienced. Frank approached the young man with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his response to his own humiliation, understanding that the cycle of service and recognition needed to continue. that each generation of veterans had a responsibility to support and guide those who followed. "Son," Frank said, settling onto the adjacent stool, "let me buy you a drink and tell you what I've learned about coming home." The conversation that followed lasted for hours, bridging the gap between generations of military service, connecting the wisdom of experience with the energy of youth, creating the kind of mentorship that military communities depend on to maintain their values and traditions. Frank shared stories of adjustment and belonging, of finding purpose after service, of the importance of remaining connected to the civilian community while maintaining the bonds of military brotherhood. The young soldier listened with the respect that one warrior shows to another, understanding that he was receiving guidance from someone whose service had been tested by time and proven through sacrifice. By the end of the evening, arrangements had been made for regular meetings, for ongoing mentorship, for the kind of relationship that would help ease the young man's transition from military to civilian life. As Frank prepared to leave Murphy's bar that night, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from humiliation to honor, from isolation to belonging, from forgotten veteran to recognized hero. The convoy had been dramatic and necessary, but this quiet evening of conversation and connection was perhaps more important. Proof that the real victory wasn't in forcing recognition, but in creating the conditions where respect and dignity could flourish naturally. Jake approached as Frank prepared to leave, carrying something that represented the final step in his own redemption. It was a frame containing Frank's military decorations, the Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device, and Purple Hearts that had been sitting in a shoebox in Frank's closet, forgotten by everyone except the man who had earned them. "Sir," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion, "I asked Mrs. Chen to help me with this. I hope you'll allow us to display these here, where they belong, where people can see them and remember what real service looks like." Frank looked at the medals, remembering the circumstances that had earned each one, the men he had saved, the prices he had paid, the young man he had been when courage was measured in split-second decisions rather than decades of quiet dignity. The decorations represented a different kind of recognition than the convoy had provided. Not public spectacle, but permanent honor, not temporary attention, but lasting respect. "Jake," Frank said quietly, "these medals don't belong to me anymore. They belong to every veteran who has ever been made to feel unwelcome, every older American who has been dismissed as irrelevant, every person who has learned that real strength sometimes looks like weakness until you understand what you're really seeing." The medals were hung in a place of honor beside the bar, where they would serve as a permanent reminder of the lessons learned from one Friday night's casual cruelty and one Saturday morning's overwhelming response. They represented not just Frank Morrison's service, but the broader obligation that communities have to recognize and honor the sacrifices made on their behalf. As Frank Morrison walked home that night, his steps steady despite his age, his dignity intact despite his years, he understood that the convoy had accomplished something beyond its original mission. It had created a transformation that would outlast any individual, a change in community consciousness that would protect future veterans from the kind of disrespect he had experienced. The story that had begun with a spilled beer and ended with a military convoy had become something larger, a reminder that heroes live among us quietly, that service should be honored regardless of age, and that the most powerful victories come not through force, but through the patient work of changing hearts and minds, one person at a time. Frank Morrison had found what he had been looking for that Friday night, a place where he belonged, where his service was recognized, where his presence was valued. It had taken a convoy of military vehicles to create that recognition, but it would be sustained by something simpler and more powerful. The understanding that respect is not earned through noise and flash, but through character and service, and the quiet dignity that marks true heroes. And in Murphy's bar, where it all began, the lesson continued to be taught every day, one conversation at a time, one veteran at a time, one moment of recognition at a time. The convoy was gone, but its message remained, embedded in the community's consciousness and reflected in the way they treated the quiet heroes who walked among them. The real victory wasn't in the dramatic display of military might, but in the simple restoration of dignity to one man whose service had earned him honor, whose age had earned him respect, and whose grace under pressure had taught an entire community what it meant to be worthy of the sacrifices made on their behalf. That's the power of recognizing the heroes who live quietly among us. It doesn't just honor their service, it reminds us all of who we're supposed to be and what we owe to each other. If this story touched your heart, if you believe our veterans deserve better than casual indifference, share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know about the quiet heroes in your own community who deserve recognition.